Back in the breaking news, the family of Chuck Norris saying that the Walker Texas Ranger star has died at the age of 86.
Chuck Norris has died, and when that news spread, many older viewers immediately went back to the films that built his image as an American hero in the 1980s. The Delta Force is always near the top of that list. What makes the Delta Force more worth talking about than many other action films of its era is that it was built on real events. The basic framework of the story comes from the 1985 hijacking of TWA Flight 847. The film also folds in the memory of the failed Eagle Claw mission in Iran, a military wound America had not forgotten by the middle of the 1980s. In other words, this was not just an action movie. It was a film trying to turn America's anger, fear, and desire for retaliation into big-screen entertainment. That is why, looking back at the Delta Force after Chuck Norris is gone, people do not just see another loud 1980s action film. They see a movie forged out of real events, real ambition, and the very real mood of Reagan-era America. Number 1. Based on the TWA Flight 847 hijacking. To understand why the Delta Force carries such a strong sense of urgency and anger, you have to go back to the hijacking of TWA Flight 847 in 1985. This was a Trans-World Airlines flight seized by Hezbollah militants after departing Athens. The crisis lasted for days. More than 100 hostages were held, and the event quickly became a symbol of the helplessness many Americans felt in the face of international terrorism at that time. The Delta Force does not recreate the event like a documentary, but the basic structure of the film mirrors the real crisis very closely. A civilian airliner is taken over, passengers are separated, Jewish and American victims are singled out, and political pressure erupts before the crisis is even resolved. That immediately sets the movie apart from a lot of action films from the same period, which only needed one villain and a few explosions to pull the audience in. Here, the film is tapping directly into a fear viewers had only recently seen on the evening news. That resemblance was not an accident. After the TWA 847 hijacking, America was in an extremely sensitive state about any story involving hijackers, hostages, and military retaliation. The Delta Force arrived at exactly that moment, so from its earliest concept, it already carried a very strong sense of topical relevance for American audiences in the mid-1980s. And the important thing is that the movie does not stop with a hijacked plane. Right at the start, it also slips in another memory of military failure, one that gives the whole story a much sharper political context. Number 2. The connection to Operation Eagle Claw. One of the things that gives the Delta Force more political weight than a standard action film is the way its opening clearly evokes Operation Eagle Claw in 1980. This was the failed American mission to rescue hostages in Iran, a disaster caused by multiple technical and coordination failures that ended with the deaths of 8 US servicemen. For the American public in the early 1980s, it remained a bitter memory, proof that even a military superpower could be humiliated in a rescue mission the whole world was watching. So when the Delta Force opens with images of a special mission running into trouble, the film is deliberately reminding viewers of that wound. It does not explain it in the way a political drama would, but it is clear enough for audiences to understand that this is a story about an America trying to rebuild its own image. And that is not accidental. After Eagle Claw, American Special Operations Forces, including Delta Force, were heavily reorganized and strengthened. But underneath all that political and military framing, the film also carries a sad cinematic detail. This would be the final screen role of Lee Marvin. Number 3. The presence of a legend. For viewers who love classic American cinema, Lee Marvin brought a very different kind of weight than a purely commercial action cast. He had won an Oscar for Cat Ballou and had long been one of the defining faces of war films, westerns, and hard-edged action pictures. In the Delta Force, he plays Colonel Nick Alexander, the seasoned commander whose cold discipline and battlefield experience balance out Chuck Norris's faster, leaner, more physical screen presence. What makes this role especially important is that it was Lee Marvin's final theatrical film before his death in 1987. So looking back now, the Delta Force is not just a Chuck Norris action vehicle. It is also the last chapter on screen for one of old Hollywood's major stars. Lee Marvin's presence gives the movie a gravity cannon films could never have created with explosions and missile-launching motorcycles alone. He brings experience. The moment he stands in frame, he gives the military side of the story credibility. That matters because the movie needs at least one commanding figure who makes the rescue operation feel like a real military structure, not just a playground for one lone hero. The pairing of Lee Marvin and Chuck Norris also feels like a handshake between two eras. One side is old-school tough Hollywood. The other is a martial arts action star rising fast in 1980s cinema. That combination widened the film's appeal. But the interesting thing is that Chuck Norris was not even the first choice for the hero, Scott McCoy. Number 4. Chuck Norris was not the first choice. One very striking fact about the Delta Force is that Chuck Norris was not the first actor considered for Scott McCoy. Based on the list you provided, the first name seriously considered was Charles Bronson. If that version had happened, the whole film probably would have carried a very different tone, because Bronson represented an older, colder revenge hero image and was far less tied to martial arts screen action than Chuck Norris. Bronson's refusal, reportedly because he disliked the script, opened the door for Chuck Norris. And looking back now, that changed everything. In the Chuck Norris version, Scott McCoy is not just a man with a gun. He brings martial arts, faster movement, and the ability to make even highly unrealistic action scenes feel acceptable within the logic of a mid-1980s action movie. Sometimes one refusal behind the scenes creates exactly the identity audiences remember forever. Without Bronson passing on the role, the Delta Force might have become a completely different kind of film, and the person who turned that casting shift into such a strong canon product was the head of the studio himself. Number 5. The director was an action movie mogul. Menahem Golan was not just the director of the Delta Force. He was also one half of the duo that turned canon films into one of the most recognizable names in 1980s B-action cinema. That is why the fact that Golan personally directed this film says something very clear. Cannon did not see this as an ordinary project. They saw it as a major swing. That makes sense if you look at the scale of the film's ambition. The Delta Force is not some small street-level story. It has terrorists, hijacked planes, military operations, international settings, Lee Marvin, Chuck Norris, and a heavy patriotic tone that mid-1980s American audiences were very ready to embrace. For Cannon, this was almost a chance to prove that the studio could do more than medium-budget action films with a few gunfights. They wanted to make something that looked bigger than the brand people already associated with them. Compared to many other Cannon films, the Delta Force was clearly pushed to a higher level of visual ambition and event scale. It had to stay close to real-world headlines while still being entertaining enough to sell tickets. The fact that Golan directed it himself shows he did not want to hand a project this risky to anyone else. The Delta Force was not just another famous Chuck Norris movie. It was also a major test of Cannon Films' ambitions in the American market. And once the studio made that kind of bet, it also needed imagery wild enough that audiences would never forget it. The most famous example of that is the motorcycle. Number 6. The impossible motorcycle. Out of all the images tied to the Delta Force, Scott McCoy's motorcycle is the one audiences remember fastest. It does not look like an ordinary military vehicle. It looks like an oversized toy dropped straight into the movie and then transformed into the film's signature icon. The bike was built from a modified Suzuki SP600, then fitted with machine guns and rockets for the climactic action sequence. This detail matters because it shows exactly how the film constructs its hero. The movie did not just want Chuck Norris shooting guns or fighting hand-to-hand. It wanted him mounted on a piece of war machinery, strange enough that audiences would still remember it after leaving the theater. The moment McCoy rides that bike into action, the movie almost shifts from hostage rescue tension into a kind of action fantasy that is pure Cannon films. But the motorcycle was not the only thing that gave the movie its distinctly Middle Eastern military flavor. Another weapon appears even more often and carries a much clearer political meaning. Number 7. The importance of the Uzi. If you re-watch the Delta Force, one weapon stands out immediately: the Uzi. This Israeli submachine gun is compact, visually distinctive, and had already become very common in 1970s and 1980s action movies. But in the Delta Force, the Uzi is not just there because it looks good on screen. It helps place the film inside the exact political world it wants to occupy. At the time, the Uzi was already a familiar image in Cold War-era action cinema. The second American audiences saw it, they thought of the Middle East, counterterrorism, special forces, and one of America's key regional allies. So when the film features it so heavily, it is deliberately placing itself inside that action military framework that American viewers were especially primed to accept. Unlike films that treat weapons as generic props, the Delta Force uses the Uzi with clear intent. It helps the world of the film feel closer to the military news footage and current events imagery audiences had already seen on television. In simple terms, it made the film feel more of its moment. And if the on-screen weapons were chosen this carefully, the way the filmmakers built battlefield effects in real life was even more surprising. Number 8. Live ammunition around the set. One of the behind-the-scenes facts most likely to shock viewers is that live ammunition was reportedly used in isolated zones to create more realistic dust and smoke effects. During explosions and combat scenes shot in Israel, security personnel assisting the production used live rounds in carefully controlled off-limit areas to generate a more authentic battlefield atmosphere. What matters here is that live ammunition does not mean the filmmakers were firing directly at actors or shooting in total chaos. The key phrase is isolated zones. The effects were created in controlled spaces, separate from the performers, to produce dust, smoke, and real physical reactions that fake effects of that period could not always reproduce convincingly. That tells you a lot about how action filmmaking in the 1980s differed from the digital era that came later. When technology was more limited, productions often had to create the most realistic possible effects right there on location. And for the Delta Force, that fit perfectly with the film's ambitions. The movie wanted audiences to feel real combat, real dust, real impact. Not just stage sparks and studio tricks. Number 9. Shot entirely in Israel. The Delta Force was shot entirely in Israel. That may surprise viewers, because in the story, the action moves through places like Greece, Lebanon, and Algeria. But instead of moving the production through multiple countries, the filmmakers shot everything in Israel to save money and maintain tighter security control. This was a very practical decision. With a movie involving planes, special forces, terrorism, and international locations, moving a crew across multiple countries would have driven the budget up fast. And in the middle of the 1980s, shooting a film about Middle Eastern terrorism in several real locations also would have brought major logistical and security risks. Israel at the time offered both the right landscapes and the ability to support a large-scale production more efficiently. It also gave the Delta Force a much more convincing atmosphere than the movie would have had if everything had been built inside an American soundstage. The runways, desert terrain, military spaces, outdoor light, and regional landscape all made the film feel much closer to the Middle East. That was a huge advantage for a movie trying to stay close to a crisis that had only recently happened in real life. Compared with many action films of the same era that used just a few exterior shots and then retreated into studios, the Delta Force leaned much harder on real locations. That helped it keep the scale canon desperately needed in order to sell it as a major event picture. Number 10. Ben Gurion Airport played multiple countries. One of the clearest examples of the production's flexibility is the way it used Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. Ben Gurion was transformed to stand in for both Athens and Beirut. That was a clever cost-saving move that still gave the audience the feeling that the story was crossing through multiple countries. This matters because the opening section of the Delta Force depends heavily on the airport setting. The audience has to believe that these passengers are starting in one place and then being pushed into an international crisis. If the airport looked fake, the film would immediately lose the layer of reality it is working so hard to build out of the real TWA 847 story. Ben Gurion solved that problem. It was a real airport, large enough, visually convincing, and perfectly suited to a movie about hijacking. Most importantly, It was already inside the region the production had chosen as its base. That meant the filmmakers did not have to split the production into too many separate countries while still maintaining the necessary geographic illusion. But Ben Gurion was only one part of the larger story. The reason the film could operate so efficiently there had a lot to do with the support it received from the Israeli government and military. Number 11. Strong military support. One of the reasons the Delta Force looks bigger than many other B-action films of its period is the substantial support it received from Israel. The production was not just there because it was cheaper. It also had access to real military hardware, from armored vehicles to aircraft and a broad range of logistical resources. That gave the film a scale Cannon films could never have built from scratch on its own. This was crucial because the Delta Force was not being sold as a small action movie. It was being sold as an international military crisis picture, with terrorism, hostages, American special forces, and a large-scale rescue response. To make audiences believe in that world, the imagery had to feel weighty. A few jeeps and some background extras would not have been enough. The support from Israel solved exactly that problem. The filmmakers got real machines, real locations, and a much more credible military atmosphere. In return, the film also presented Israel as a strong, modern ally in the eyes of American viewers, one willing to support anti-terror operations. Number 12. The iconic theme song. The score of the Delta Force is one of the main reasons the movie has outlived its own plot. The composer was Alan Silvestri, who would later become one of the most famous names in Hollywood music through films like Back to the Future, Forrest Gump, and years later, The Avengers. But even here, in the Delta Force, he was already showing something very clearly. He knew how to write music that made audiences feel like they were watching a mission bigger than ordinary life. The main theme does not creep into the background and disappear. It pushes directly into grandeur, urgency, and military energy. It is the kind of score that makes a movement scene or a preparation scene feel larger and more important than it otherwise would. The moment the music begins, the audience understands that the movie wants them to see this not as a small gunfight, but as a mission tied to national pride. Because the score is so forceful, parts of it later found a second life in American television sports coverage. That does not happen to every action film. Only scores that are strong, clear, and instantly recognizable can detach from the movie and survive on their own. And if the score is one of the things that elevates the action, the man performing much of that action was Chuck Norris himself, even though he was already in his 40s. Number 13. Chuck Norris did many of his own stunts. When the Delta Force was shot, Chuck Norris was already past 40. For many action stars, that is the stage when they start depending much more heavily on stunt doubles, especially in high-speed driving, close combat, or dangerous physical sequences. But on this film, Chuck Norris still performed most of his own fights and a large portion of the motorcycle work himself. That matters because it explains why his action in the film feels so direct. Viewers are not just watching a character created through clever editing. They are watching Chuck Norris himself in the frame, riding the motorcycle, throwing strikes, and pushing his body into sequences riskier than what many stars at his age would normally attempt. It also fits perfectly with the screen image he built throughout his career. Chuck Norris did not want audiences to believe in Scott McCoy just because of clever camera placement. He wanted them to believe because the man inside the frame truly had the physical ability to do those things. When the central star steps into dangerous scenes himself, the film instantly gains more credibility. But even though Chuck Norris is the center of the movie, he is not the only person viewers remember. The villain is strong enough that many critics still single him out by name. Number 14. A truly memorable villain. A film like The Delta Force could easily have fallen into the trap of giving its villain only one job: shout, hold a gun, and wait to be killed. But Robert Forster does not let Abdul become that kind of role. He turns him into someone audiences genuinely hate, someone who feels dangerous every time he appears. Forster's strength is that he does not play Abdul as a flat caricature. The character is absolutely cruel and absolutely hateful, But the way Forster speaks, watches the hostages, and controls the mood inside the plane makes the threat feel much more specific. Viewers do not just understand that he is the bad guy. They feel why he is dangerous. That is especially important for this film because the first half of the Delta Force has to hold tension before Chuck Norris fully erupts in the second half. If Abdul is weak, the hijacking section loses its power. If Abdul is strong, audiences wait for the rescue with much more intensity. Robert Forster gives the film exactly that. Number 15. Why the airline name was changed. In real life, the direct inspiration for the Delta Force was TWA Flight 847. But when the story was brought to the screen, the filmmakers did not keep the airline's real name. Instead, they changed it to ATW, the initials for a fictional company called American Travelways. That looks like a tiny change, but legally it mattered a lot. The reason is obvious. When a movie closely follows a real hijacking, keeping the real airline name could create legal and reputational problems. The airline would have little reason to want its brand tied again to a commercial terrorism film. And the studio's lawyers would have had no interest in opening another legal front over a few letters painted on the side of a plane. Changing the name was the simplest, safest move. But even after making that adjustment, the film still lost part of itself in the editing room. Not for legal reasons, but for pacing reasons. And that decision helped shift the entire second half of the movie more aggressively into action. Number 16. Claustrophobic hostage scenes were cut down. If you watch the opening half of the Delta Force carefully, you can still feel that the movie once wanted to stay longer inside the fear of the hostages on the plane. But according to behind-the-scenes accounts repeated over the years, a longer section focused on hostage psychology was trimmed during the final editing process. The reason was clear. The filmmakers did not want to sit too long in powerlessness and anxiety. They wanted to move quickly into retaliation. That choice changes the whole shape of the film. If those scenes had remained, the Delta Force might have become a slower, heavier, sadder hijacking movie. Audiences would have spent more time inside the terror of the civilians. But once that material was reduced, the movie made a different choice. It used pain and panic mainly as fuel to launch Chuck Norris and the rescue team into the center of the story. That editorial decision also reveals exactly what kind of emotional experience the movie wanted to deliver. It did not mainly want viewers sitting with tragedy. It wanted them frustrated, angry, and then exhilarated when the counterattack finally began. So the hostage psychology was reduced, while the action was strengthened. And for all that the movie is named after Delta Force, the real men from that unit did not want to step forward publicly and help define it. Number 17. The real Delta Force stayed silent. A film called The Delta Force naturally makes viewers assume the production must have had direct cooperation from the real unit. But the reality was more complicated. The actual men in Delta Force had no reason to step into public view, give interviews, and explain how they operated for the sake of a commercial movie. Based on what is known from behind-the-scenes reporting, they declined any public advisory role in order to protect both their identities and their methods. That makes perfect sense if you understand what a special operations force is. Delta Force was not created to be famous. It operated in secrecy, and that secrecy was part of its power. If real members had publicly consulted on the film, people would immediately have started asking about tactics, procedures, weapons, hostage protocols, and all kinds of other details the US military had no interest in sharing. So the Delta Force ends up in a strange position. It takes the name of a real force, draws energy from real events, but cannot get too close to the actual people at the center of that story. That distance gave the movie more freedom to exaggerate. It did not have to be accurate to the point of becoming a military reconstruction. And even without public confirmation from the real soldiers, the film still achieved the thing canon needed most. Audiences showed up in large numbers, enough to make it a real commercial success. Number 18. A strong box office hit. In pure box office terms, The Delta Force was not an A-level Hollywood mega hit. But for an action film carrying the very specific Cannon Films identity, a domestic gross close to $18 million was a strong result. It proved that the movie had connected with exactly what audiences wanted at that moment: a story about terrorism, hostages, and an American counterstrike told in a direct, accessible, and forceful way. And the important thing is not just the number itself, it is what that number meant afterward. When a movie like this makes good money, the studio immediately understands that this is not a one-time experiment. It is a brand that can be extended, and that is exactly what happened. The Delta Force led to sequels, even if none of them ever matched the first film's impact. Compared with many B-action films from the same era that came and went quickly, the Delta Force did something harder. It created a title the studio could keep selling. That is one of the clearest signs that a movie is not just profitable in its opening run. It has created a strong enough image to be exploited again. Number 19. The friendship between the two stars. When an old-school Hollywood star like Lee Marvin works opposite a rising martial arts action star like Chuck Norris, some initial distance is easy to understand. Lee Marvin came from a very different generation of actors, with a very different reputation and status. Chuck Norris at that point was still seen by many people first as a fighter who had crossed into film, not necessarily as an actor the old guard would immediately regard as an equal. That is why the fact that the two men reportedly grew close on set is such an interesting detail. What seems to have changed Lee Marvin's mind was not some polite conversation. It was the way Chuck Norris worked. He showed up on time, prepared seriously, did many of his own difficult scenes, and did not behave like a man relying only on martial arts fame. For someone as seasoned as Lee Marvin, that kind of professionalism meant a great deal. This gives the Delta Force another layer of interest. The film did not just stick two stars together to sell tickets. It also created a real respect between two generations of screen toughness. One man was an old Hollywood legend reaching the end of his career. The other was an action icon entering the strongest stage of his own. And once those two men found real respect for each other, the movie gained something beyond guns and explosions. Number 20. A wider cultural impact. To really understand the place of the Delta Force, you have to place it inside Reagan-era America. This was a period when American action cinema was deeply drawn to stories about national strength, decisive retaliation, and the belief that America could rewrite earlier humiliations through force. The Delta Force sits directly inside that current. It does not hide its patriotism. It builds almost all of its emotional momentum around it. The film begins with humiliation and fear. Hijackers, hostages, helplessness, and the memory of failed military action. Then it ends with retaliation, organization, firepower, and the image of Americans taking control again. That was a formula perfectly matched to the emotional climate of the American public in the 1980s. Audiences did not just want action, they wanted to see America win again on screen. Compared with many other action films of the same period that focus on personal revenge, the Delta Force carries a much stronger national identity. Its hero is not just saving a few people for private reasons. He enters the story as a representative of American strength, of the country's ability to strike anywhere when its citizens are threatened. The Delta Force does not just show how Chuck Norris fights, how he rides, or how cool he looks on screen. It also shows how Hollywood used him to construct the image of an American hero during a period full of tension, anger, and obsession with terrorism. That is why the film is still talked about today. Out of these 20 secrets, which detail about the Delta Force surprised you the most? Leave it in the comments below. And if you want me to keep digging into behind-the-scenes truths, classic action films, and the lesser-known stories behind screen legends like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell.